Well, good morning. Happy Feast of Saints Simon and Jude, who are probably the two apostles that we know the least about. A little bit of rumor out there or legend out there, but frankly, we really don't know a whole lot about them. I think it's interesting that we chose this gospel, which is just Jesus calling the apostles. And right off the bat, I love in particular, we read St. Luke's version, and I think we read it because it spells out a little more clearly, who Simon was, who was called a zealot, and who Judas, who was the son of James. Okay. But in the version of St. Mark, it says that Jesus called to himself those whom he wanted. And that's a very beautiful expression. He knew them, he called them by name, he wanted them to be his chosen disciples. We know that he didn't call any of them because of superhuman qualities. None of them, for example, was like St. Paul, who had so many different gifts and training and education and whatnot. He called ordinary men, but he called men who had great hearts. He called men who would allow him to work through them. And when you look at the list of names of people that he called, I remember when I was in the seminary formation years, one of the priests preached a homily. It was kind of funny. He said, look, only Jesus could have made this group of men work. And he pointed out, for example, the fact that you have Matthew, who is a tax collector, right? Now, to be a tax collector in the eyes of many Jewish people was to be a Roman cooperator. So he was working with the enemy. And then you have a guy like Saint Simon, who we're celebrating today, who is a zealot. Now, zealots were sworn to kill people like Saint Matthew. You have one guy, to be a zealot was practically to say he was a terrorist. Okay? So somebody who, due to religious beliefs, the idea behind the zealots is very simple. Israel, the only king in Israel, and this is actually kind of a truth, is God himself. So, therefore, anybody who puts himself up as king, especially a foreign power, is militating against God himself. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that works because God clearly did raise up a line of kings, first through anything but Saint Saul. First through Saul and then through David's line. But ultimately, God himself is the foundation of the kinghood in Israel, and he himself would become the one and true king through Christ, right? So there's a truth there. And you have this sect of people who were militant and would assassinate and kill and cause disruptions. Actually, the destruction of Jerusalem is attributed to the zealots, leading an uprising against the Romans, and the Romans saying, okay, this is the last straw, and coming in and just destroying everything, okay? So if Simon was one of them, and he's hanging out with St. Matthew, the tax collector, you can imagine, only the grace of God would bring about such a conversion. St. Jude, we don't frankly know, son of James, I don't know who James was. I don't think he was St. James the Apostle. St. James the Apostle was a young man, so don't think it was that. He's also known as St. Thaddeus. You remember a few years ago when St. Jude's relics were traveling through here and people were going and praying, and there seemed to be some legitimate miracles and stuff taking place. The funny story about St. Jude is, in reality, his name is Judas. And I think it's only in English, I think, that we shortened it to Jude to distinguish him. And does everyone here know why he's considered to be the saint of impossible cases, or why when you have something impossible, you go to St. Jude? It's actually kind of a funny story. The idea is, because he shared the same name as Judas the betrayer, nobody wants to pray to him. So if you go to St. Jude, he's like, Lord, nobody prays to me in the first place. You got to grant this miracle. So that's kind of the logic behind it. But there seems to be a truth to it. It seems St. Jude has quite a following. Don't know much about him. And I think this can give us also some hope for our Christian lives. Every person in this church has been called. The same way that in Mark's Gospel we said Jesus called those to himself whom he wanted. Okay, every single person in this church right now has been called by Christ, and you are wanted. Some of you, probably nobody in here is going to be famous. Probably nobody here is going to be remembered as some great Catholic. But just as with the apostles, you have certain apostles. Matthew wrote a gospel. Peter, James, John, the famous guys. And then you have the other apostles that you don't really think much about. Bartholomew, Simon the Zealot, Jude. Who thinks of them? And nonetheless, God used them and continues to use them today. So they were relative to the other apostles, they were obscure. And some of us in this church will be obscure. And nonetheless, God wants to work miracles in you and through you. And it's really going to come down to just simply holiness of life. If we are holy, it doesn't matter if anyone knows anything about you. It doesn't matter if anybody thinks you're holy or not. If you're holy, you probably won't believe you're holy in the first place. And quite possibly nobody else will believe you're holy, but God will know it. And if we are holy, then, like the relatively obscure St. Jude, God will work great miracles, and possibly works greater miracles through devotion to St. Jude, the case of the impossible, than he does through, other apostles. Quite possibly. So, in the end of the day, it's not such a bad thing to be obscure.